Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Connect2Car Roundtable, Technology Transition, Cloud and Car-Enabled Digital Services. This roundtable is sponsored by 5G Automotive Association. Your moderator is James Meisner, Qualcomm Technologies Incorporated. You are invited to submit questions for today's roundtable through the SAE International's WCX app. Ladies and gentlemen, James Meisner.
Thank you very much for attending our session. We have a group of industry experts who come from a variety of sectors within a sector, and that sector I would consider to be that crux between technology and communication. So I thank you all for this, and it promises to be a good 70 minutes or so of discussion. I'm going to read to you hopefully something that provoked you to come here, which is 5G, V2X, edge computing. Where will it end for enabled digital services and connectivity? Where should we be investing our time and in which technology? And by the end of this, you'll know. How will we manage it? What are the best tools for each situation? So these experts will go and talk to you about this. So I'm going to go over who these experts are by asking them a question and asking them in the response to the question to kind of give their perspective but introduce themselves as they do this. So my first question is fairly straightforward, as we've practiced it a little bit in advance, but what are the biggest challenges you're facing in light of this setup?
Well, thank you. I'm Brian Keller from AT&T. I work in a group called the Internet of Things, and our focus, at least in my group's focus, is the connected vehicle systems. To answer your question, Jim, the challenges, well, there are a lot of challenges. There's a great deal of challenge for the automakers because a large number of vehicles are not going to be equipped to take advantage of the edge yet. They have older TCUs and older equipment, so by the time they leave the road system, the next generation of systems will be put in place. For us to put out 5G, that's not really a big deal. We do networks all the time. And when I say all the time, it wasn't long ago that LTE launched, and now we're into 5G. But the challenge that really will exist is the edge, because that's a pretty nascent definition going on right now. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Not so much in the automotive industry to start with, but the edge from a manufacturing point of view is right there in the premise. That's a pretty simple problem to solve because you can take your network traffic and just route it to the local area and you're good to go. But when vehicles are moving around out there in the world, mobility is a problem. Now, we solve mobility in the telco world with standards. The edge is not a standard at the moment. It's just a compute platform. So trying to figure out how applications will move from edge to edge if they have to even do that, or how your digital twin, if that's what we want to call them, will move as you move along the roadways is a challenge right now. We're talking about it. I get a chance to talk about that in a group called the Automotive Edge Computing Consortium, as well as with the 5GAA team. The other challenges are it costs money to deploy this stuff, and there has to be a return on investment. That's a key area of concern at the moment because I don't think any of us have cracked that code yet on how you're going to return your investments in this area. That's not going to stop us. From a 5G point of view, we already have deployed it. You saw maybe an announcement yesterday that we added 7 more cities to a 19-city deployment. There is a smartphone that has 5G capability. It uses millimeter wave, which is a technology that's mostly for a fixed wireless solution. You hear other competitors of ours proposing 5G out there, and it's kind of cool. But it doesn't help you if you're moving around in a vehicle. You have to have another thing called sub-6. And the chipsets, which you guys are working on, just aren't ready yet. They're on their way, but that's the challenge. The chipset's not ready, the network's not deployed, the car guys want to start experimenting, and those intersections haven't occurred yet, but the marketing hype is rich.
So I guess you're on the edge because you need Qualcomm chipsets.
I'm a little edgy today.
That's right, that's right. Mitch, your point of view on.
Sure, so my name is Mitch Dornick. I am with SiriusXM. I'm with a group, part of SiriusXM that nobody knows exists. We've been providing telematics services since 1996. We do it as a white label product, so we power most of the major OEMs telematics services, either do now or have in the past. So when everybody hears SiriusXM, I'm on a panel, it's like, oh, why is there a radio guy or an audio guy that's going to talk about what we're doing here? So a little different approach. So the challenge from my standpoint is the fact that we don't define the technology, right? We are, because we're providers, we're reacting to what our customers want to put into their vehicles. And often it's a tiered strategy, meaning they may go out from a brand standpoint and put top tier technology in the higher level, higher tier products, and then not in the lower ones. And so for me, as I design and develop and launch products, they have to be able to support that whole span. I mean, we literally turned down support for 2G last year for some vehicles, right? So the support life cycle is really long. And when you're thinking about it from a product standpoint, you have to be able to do that. So, my competition is this, right? Because we all take this in our car, even though we're not supposed to, and our expectations are this, and this gets flashed and updated like crazy. You probably get a new one every 2 years, every 3 years. That's not the way it works for a car, right? The car is on the road for 10 or 15 years, even though it may have multiple owners. And so it's a challenge to be able to support these different levels of technology on the continuum, but also across the different brand strategies that within an OEM and across OEMs.
Thank you. Sure. Hank.
Hi, my name is Hank Scorney, and I run a division as part of Aptiv that's called Connected Services. And we've been actually doing connected vehicles now for about 15 years across all of the major OEMs. We've been doing it for engineering, test, validation, and manufacturing, as well as OTA and reflashing. So we have vast experience with collecting massive amounts of data off of the car. But one of the main challenges I see now is as we move on to how do we get into the production and the customer ecosystem, how do we get standardized platforms, and I think I heard that a little bit coming from other areas, to be able to create software applications that can truly show off the power and the value of data. Because if we're forced to do vertical integrated solutions for every single value proposition, I don't think we're ever going to be able to get the value of the data that I think we all expect to have. And that spans everything from enhanced learning for advanced safety systems to dealer management to consumer applications and music. So I think this standardized hardware and software platforms is absolutely critical to be able to succeed.
Thank you. It's a good point of view from Optiv, and Maxime from 5GAA.
So thank you,
Jim,
Jim, for hosting this and this discussion. It's very important. So the 5GA is a relatively young association. It's 2 years old. It started with 8 members, and then now is more than 120, or almost 120 members from all over the world, focusing on pre-standardization, but also on other aspects that are essential, so spectrum allocation, regulations, and as well as the business model. So for us, what's important is that we know that in the very near future, all vehicles are going to be somehow connected, and we have to make sure that this connectivity really serves the automotive needs, the automotive industry needs. And there are a few standardization elements or building blocks that are important to us. So obviously, we all know LTE, LTE Advanced, and Advanced Pro. And within LTE Advanced Pro, there is a specific CV2X standard that brings together the connectivity to the network, but also between the different vehicles in the proximity of the vehicles and with the infrastructure. So that's what we call V2V, V2I. And it has been around for a long time, but there we really have a trigger point where we are offering a full solution between these device-to-device communication and connectivity with the network. And we want to make sure that as the vehicles are getting connected, they also offer this little piece of technology for vehicle to vehicle, and that is offering safety, offering better traffic management options, and eventually saving lives. Yes.
So when I hear challenges, I think you say all of the above, or are there any specific challenges within
yeah,
that
well,
very
the
large?
specific challenge is really to form the ecosystem, to make sure that the right industry, so the telecom industry and the vehicle manufacturing industry is getting it's learning from each other and willing to create that ecosystem. Now that ecosystem can only exist also if you include the roadside operators, so the road owners, and making sure that the road owners also don't necessarily only think of their connectivity through roadside units, but also use the capabilities of the clouds to get their information, the information that they need for their road operations.
So a lot of cats to herd.
Yes, indeed.
All right.
So.
Satu.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Hi to everyone who's here and also to everybody who is listening this via the podcast. My name is Sethu Raman Gopal, and I'm the Senior Director and Head of the Connected Car and Digital Experience at an electric car startup called Rivian. Rivian is launching 2 vehicles towards the end of 2020. One of them is a 5-seater pickup truck, and the other one is a 7-seater SUV. And the infotainment system, the cloud ecosystem, and the apps is my group's responsibility. 3 challenges actually come to my mind. Obviously, there are hundreds of challenges, but if I had to just pick out the top 3, the first one happens to be sort of the unknown with this technology embracement itself. So the 5G has been in talks for a while. The 5G will ultimately culminate in a broader adoption. But given the pace at which the OEMs will want to move and then put a product out there, and to the others who mentioned about the product having a sustained life of more than 10-15 years, there has to be some line drawn in the sand to say, here is what technology we will adopt. And I think for us at least, we have gone the route of saying, okay, 5G is too far away or not too materialistic at this point in time. And so we had to sort of scale back and then say, our vehicles will launch with the existing mature technology, which is the 4G. And then obviously we are going to be watching the space to try and understand the benefits, in fact the maturity of 5G and the product itself coming together. That sort of is a segue into the second sort of challenge, which is the antenna design itself. Believe it or not, it's a very physical thing, it's an age-old art, but it's a very tricky one, especially when you want to do it on a surface where you don't want to have the shark fin, for example. If you're very, very design conscious, it throws a wrench into how the placements can be very challenging, because believe it or not, the body guys will not give you an inch. And so that's a challenge that you will face, where you put this in the middle, do you put it in the front, do you put it on the roof? So given that, especially now we are talking about 5G, where you have all these 4x4 MIMOs, where you want to have some sense of directional beamforming and all that, you need to almost have something which is a profile above the roof, which is not agreeable from a styling perspective. So that is becoming a challenge for us, where how do you place these different antennas in different locations, get the benefit of something like a 4x4 MIMO, and yet still be ready for some other technology which comes 10-15 years down the line. So I think those are the kind of challenges we are fighting purely from an antenna design perspective. There are innovations like RF switching, going through multiple antennas and then figuring out which is the best one. I think it's an area almost ripe for, in some sense, an innovation and research. We are trying to focus on that area. The third challenge is going to be quantification of the cloud data itself. We talk about the data being sent to the cloud, stored, processed, and obviously the monetization in itself is going to be difficult because we don't know what the revenue stream will look like. But the buzz is that there is money in the data, there is going to be some sort of integration, and that the integration is actually going to end up in a happy sort of marriage. But the issue is nobody knows how much data do we really want to push. One is obviously it's going to start getting more and more expensive if you're using the pipe. And now imagine millions of cars actually wanting to eat up that spectrum, the available bandwidth to actually push all of the data. If you're sending data which is bursty, smaller bytes, like how the IoT does, then that's a completely different ballgame. Now you're talking about sending camera information, LiDAR information. You in fact want to have the capability to push all of this data, forgetting what you want to do now. You just want to have the capability that 5 years down the line, you want to think of a use case that you want to work on a data which you collected 5 years back, for which you didn't think of the use case 5 years back. And I think that's going to be a continuing challenge. If you looked at some data points around these, a typical vehicle sends about 3 GB of data in a day. That is what they collect during the development phase. That's tons of data that you want to keep pushing over a period of time. So you have to really balance out and then figure out how do you, it's almost as if you want to have a strategy now for a use case that you don't know exists, which is going to be the very difficult portion. But the other part of this is also the data which is coming in. Now that you have all the streaming services, if you talked about just the FM, for example, people have been moving away from the typical over-the-air broadcast solution to an internet radio-like solution. The moment you switch over to that, now you're again consuming data over the pipe. At 64 kilobits per second of audio, you're consuming about 30 megs an hour. And there's a lot of data that adds up over a period of time. And also the utilization, as more and more gig economy and the people start using the vehicles more and more, because that's the push currently, where the utilization wants to be bumped up from the 9 or 10% which currently exists today, because it's being parked in the garage, it's being parked in the office spaces, not much utilization, but the Ubers and the Lyfts are bringing those utilizations up. But moving towards the mobility as a platform where sharing is a big portion, utilization goes up, which means now the data consumption also starts to be more and more. So I think the quantification of that data is going to be really, really difficult, and that in turn in some ways will drive what connectivity truly means and what the cloud will look like.
Good. I was beginning to think you'd never run out of challenges, and there are many, as you've nicely elucidated. Don from Ford.
Thanks, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here on this panel, and you've heard a lot of the challenges, and I could repeat many of those. I'll speak from a Ford perspective. So I'm the Executive Director of Connected Vehicle Platform and Product. So basically, I'm in charge of the underlying architecture and infrastructure for connectivity on which services will be delivered. And for me, I sort of boil it down to speed, scale, and system cost and capability. Speed from the standpoint of literally connecting our vehicles, and we sort of maybe take it for granted that all our vehicles are going to be connected as we go forward in the future, but just from a Ford perspective, if you go back to 2007, right, we've really been focused on the broad-end device, right, and leveraging sync to interact with that device and leveraging the capability of that device. And so that's kind of been where Ford has been for the last few years. And when I joined the company in 2014, it was really to help undergo a fundamental shift to literally say, no kidding, we are going to need to connect all of our vehicles with an embedded data modem. Now, the challenge with that is that's not the path that the company had been on for a great deal of time. And so even as late as calendar year 2018, less than half of our vehicles in the US had that embedded modem data connection. But from a standpoint of speed, our new CEO, when he came in, Jim Hackett, said, you know what, I really want to enable smart vehicles for a smart world, and those smart vehicles have to literally talk to that smart world. So connectivity is going to be key for us. We need to move quickly. And so that's one of the reasons that we said by the end of this calendar year, all of our vehicles in the US, and actually all of our vehicles, new vehicles that we build in China, will have that embedded modem data connection, which if you think about less than half in calendar 2018, and by the end of this year, 100% of our vehicles being connected, those of you that have been in design and development programs in the automotive know how significant a task that is. But in order for us to do that, we had to really break a lot of rules that had been in place previously in order to move quickly, in order to get that speed. Secondly, scale, right? All of a sudden, we're talking millions of vehicles being connected, and from a cloud perspective, being able to deliver services to those vehicles with a high degree of quality. And so, 99.99% availability and reliability all of a sudden becomes a lot more important. And when you've got a handful of vehicles, the incident occurrence is maybe not that significant. But when you're talking about literally millions of vehicles connected and consumers beginning to rely on them for services that you provide, all of a sudden that scale becomes something that you've got to deal with in a very robust way. Secondly, in terms of scale and sort of the challenges that we face is those vehicles, as Setu was mentioning, they're consuming data. And as we project forward, a lot more data looking at where we're going. And so working in partnership with our friends at AT&T here in North America and Vodafone in Europe, right? All of a sudden we need to think about data consumption costs and what those are really going to mean. And then that leads into the third challenge, which is system cost and capability. And so it's not just the data cost in terms of connectivity and what the platform needs to be able to handle in order to, again, deliver those services in an economic way, but it's the total system cost as well. And so if you think about our vehicles and the antennas, wiring, the modem itself, microphones, everything else that's involved, and then if you think about the benefits of connectivity that we want to convey, which is data ingestion, data acquisition, delivering over-the-air updates, right? In terms of the vehicle infrastructure, for those of you again that are familiar, right? Our onboard LANs were not set up to be data dispensing and data acquisition pipes, right? They were set up to enable control mechanisms for various modules on board the vehicle, and so we've had to fundamentally shift how the vehicles themselves are architected, moving more to a services-oriented architecture on board the vehicle in order to get that capability. And all of that takes time. I would love to have had the benefit of starting from scratch, like Rivian and Tesla, for instance, but I've got a legacy of architectures that I've got to move forward as we go through time. And then the final thing from an overall system cost perspective, I'll get back to the data side of it. Our data analysts and our data scientists, they want to just get loads and loads of data, right? I'll figure out what to do with it later. Again, as Setu was mentioning, well, there's a cost to that data transport. And so how do you strike that balance between how much am I bringing in versus how much am I going to leave at the cloud, leave in the edge, versus how much am I actually going to process on board and then just give the intelligent insights from the vehicle itself. And so lots of challenges in the space in terms of scale, in terms of speed, in terms of system cost and reliability. And the nice thing is those challenges will never go away. So I keep busy at my job. My folks keep busy as well, and it's an exciting space for us.
This panel was taken deliberately chosen for its diversity of thought leaders, but a lot of the thoughts are converging, I note, and some of the challenges are common, and it stems from hardware all the way through telematic services. A common thread here, and it is actually a question I was going to pose, and I'm reading, and this is why I was a little distracted. It's hard for me to do two things at once. Some of the questions. The fundamental question is, what is 5G? But let me embellish this with some questions from the audience, which are subsets of those questions. We can confirm or dispute some of these statements, but one of them is a lot of communication companies are rolling out 5G, but a lot of those are not really 5G technologies, like millimeter wave, beamforming, and other things. Companies are in a rush. That's subset number one as to what is 5G, just so we can address that. Another is what does 5G enable over 4G for connected cars? That may or may not be a technology question, but I posed it as a subset of one. What's the biggest benefit in terms of bandwidth, latency, edge computing, or what else? So it's posed at least as a technology question. So I'll just ask this, and anyone who wants to step forward, to start with a fundamental, maybe even a business or a hardware definition of 5G, so that we can all be on a common basis. Does anyone want to be intrepid here and take that first step?
Well,
I'll take a stab. I'll start, and then my more technically capable
You're quite technically capable. I know
fellow
you,
panelists
John.
can kind of correct me, but from an OEM perspective, right, as we think about and we look at 5G, first of all, cellular technology in general and the way that it's evolved, we always tend to think of a point in time and all of a sudden everyone will have this great bandwidth, high throughput, and actually it's a scale of evolution. And so when someone says, when will 5G arrive? Well, in fact, right, what we've announced from a Ford perspective is that beginning in 2022 in the US and actually 2021 in China, we'll be launching what we call CV to X on our vehicles, so cellular vehicle to everything. And that was made possible, as Maxime alluded to earlier, by release 14 of 3GPP. And so the interesting thing about 5G is it's the culmination of just a series of continuous developments in terms of 3GPP and the specifications that are released. And so we will begin to see the benefits from what we might view of as 5G, and in this case, the specification that allows direct device-to-device communication as opposed to needing to go through the tower. So beginning in 2021 in China and 2022 here in the US, the CV2X capability of the evolution on the path to 5G, we're going to be planning to offer here at Ford. And so as we move into release 15 and release 16, which that is the point at which I think 5G is finally and fully codified, the plan is to set ourselves up to be flexible so that we can adapt and adjust, and as the bandwidth needs determine that, hey, that speed and that throughput makes sense for us, then we'll move in that direction. The challenge that we have as an OEM, if I go back to that overall system cost perspective, we have to, and again, this is something that Setu alluded to, we have to sort of decide at what point does it make sense for us to deploy this capability across our vehicles so that it will be fully utilized, and that certainly doesn't make sense right now for 5G, because where are we, like 19 cities, I think AT&T has just recently announced, and even that is much more around a fixed wireless perspective. As you mentioned, there's still challenges with mobile, and so we're planning for flexibility, looking forward in the future, and making sure that we've got use cases that would actually justify what 5G means for us. As we move into an autonomous age, and again, from a Ford perspective, we said beginning in 2021, we'll begin to launch our autonomous vehicles. That vehicle will not require 5G when it's initially operating. But we do envision use cases that can leverage 5G as we go forward in the future, around things like smart intersections and infrastructure where potentially sensors are built into the infrastructure itself, so they don't need to be on board the vehicle. That information can be communicated in a low latency, high bandwidth manner to a vehicle to enable a further purview and a further vision than just that vehicle's potential LiDAR, radar, and camera suite itself. And so, yeah, we see some things going forward in the future, but for us, it's like, what can we do today to take advantage of that capability? And so for us, CV2X, beginning to implement device-to-device or vehicle-to-vehicle communication without going through the network. But then as we go forward in the future, understanding those specific use cases that will then drive the further deployment of 5G. But it starts for us with the release 14, but the nice thing is it's an evolutionary path.
Thank you. It's great to hear from an applications and automotive OEM perspective. Any other perspectives, or can you enlighten the whole group here as to what is 5G?
Yeah, Don, you did a great job, by the way.
Yes.
Were you in telecommunications in your former life? I like that idea of the evolution because I've been in the telco business for about 18 years now, and I started in a narrowband network, and we innovated with a thing called a research in motion BlackBerry. And that was very innovative because email wasn't delivered before in good ways. It was done over circuit switch data over a modem. That was kind of inefficient, and then research in motion came along. And then this other company called Apple came along, and we innovated with Apple. They put out a really cruddy first phone, which was their Edge phone, on a cruddy network for that application, but it set the course. The standards people have all along been walking the path on what was called GSM, and we, of course, AT&T adopted GSM. Others didn't adopt GSM until late, until LTE came along. So what is 5G? Well, it's just the next iteration of the standards, really, but it brings a lot of disruption too, because the antenna designs are different, the chipsets are different, the module formats are different, the power requirements for these modules are different. And it goes on and on and on. Every evolution brings new and new things. The pager you used to wear on your hip, some of you look a little old too, like me, was a 3-watt thing by your hip. I don't think there's any lawsuits coming our way as a consequence of that. Your phone is a lot less than that right now in terms of what it radiates. So 5G is evolution. Now, the question about, well, what really will be 5G? There'll be a few definitions of it, I think, because 5G has a fixed mobile component. And what's really nice about when that happens is the rest of the transportation industry that we are around, which is driven, of course, by the cars, are going to need connectivity that isn't necessarily going to come from the fiber channels that the DOTs put out there. Rural areas in particularly are going to need things. So 5G will play a role there for the fixed mobile side. In terms of mobility, that's the sub-6 spectrum, and that has to exist because you need distribution and penetration, because things like trees and buildings get in the way, and millimeter wave won't do very well that way, as an example.
So to answer an explicit part of the question, 5G encompasses, in terms of delivery, it encompasses millimeter wave technology.
It does, and
Right.
the other thing that most people, what's lost is the combination of technologies that have formed. In the old day when we put a network in place, we bought purpose-built hardware, specifically designed by network equipment providers, and it was really expensive to do, and it was hard, it was forklifting. Well, virtualization came along, and the idea of the software-defined network came along. AT&T jumped on board, became a leader in that area, as opposed to a follower, and we changed out our network. So our network is mostly a software-based virtual network, meaning we don't have to use this purpose-built hardware any longer. Elements are now just in software, and we can deploy them on small systems and large systems. What 5G and the standards now provide us is this opportunity to do what's called a user plane breakout. I know that's tech talk for a network guy and your automotive people, but what's really important about that is traffic normally had to go route a long distance. And we tried our best to make sure it was pretty close to you, which made you feel good about your Netflix stream or the piece of content you were receiving. Now, because the software, the way we've built the networks now, and the user plane breakouts, we can put little network elements close to where you are, really, really close, and have the network breakout. And that's where the latency improvements come along. Everybody thinks 5G will by itself create this panacea of latency improvement. It won't. On the air interface, it's much faster, that's true. But that's such a small component of the latency equation, it's the rest of it. So that's the part AT&T plays a big role in, because we own a fairly substantial network that's beyond cellular. It's called mostly the internet. And we have ways to help our partners route that data that's in that edge or in that cloud fast and secure, which is another thing you all are going to want, is to make sure security's there. And the standards will go a long way to that, but I assure you that companies like AT&T and others that can actually stitch together this connectivity that you need and want are going to be the ones that make the biggest difference for that eventual future that we're going to live in, especially in the autonomous world.
Thank you. I'm just going to use moderator's discretion to make an observation that Don started by talking about direct communications, but using the same types of waveforms. And you're talking about how you would deliver to a network. So the various components in here, there's I use jargon, but the ultra reliable, low latency communication aspect, which could be delivered by a network, or it could be delivered, at least in terms of low reliability, so high reliability, low latency, by direct communication, which is a safety proposition. And you're talking about perhaps the whole enterprise of how you deliver so that people can instantiate the services that they want through your networks too.
Well, the truth is, the data is not going to always be next to each other.
Right.
There's further away things that happen in transportation, right? The car accident, the police cruisers that are in an area, right? So you want to have that kind of information made available.
Right.
I think you actually hit on something that's of interest to me, in that 5G really is about flexibility, right? From spanning localized connectivity, CBRS, which for those of you who don't know is effectively like Wi-Fi that really roams and works. You get a local high bandwidth connectivity that's based on much more standardized cellular technology, and then go all the way up through having the network connectivity. But the thing that really interests me about that is the ability now to do much more advanced applications because of that flexibility of connectivity. So you can do things like active safety applications where vehicles communicate with one another using this new form of connectivity that you could not do before on the older networks. And this is where, like, one of the things that we do is very client or edge compute and server compute. You want to be able to handle data locally and now even make decisions on that data, so that you can decide if, based on current operating environments, whether or not you change battery utilization. And you can communicate locally to be able to do that and understand what's locally going on and traffic situations locally, but then flip up to the network to collect topographical data. So I think that flexibility, that 5G, it's almost more important than the bandwidth and the latency. Obviously the latency is kind of follows quickly on with safety systems, but that flexibility is critical.
So thank you, Hank. And actually, you read some of the questions we talked about before, but B, you read someone's mind. And I'd like to go do a little round robin, starting with some of the folks who haven't spoken much. This is a very good question, phrased better than I could have ever done it. It's just quick examples of the usefulness of connected vehicles. And each of us have a different business or safety perspective, but let me start with you, Mitch, from a serious perspective.
Yeah, so I think, the technology's hard, don't get this statement wrong, but it's not just about the technology. And I think that it's not like you suddenly look up and we're there. It's typically a rearview mirror. I look backwards and I'm like, oh, we accomplished a milestone at a point in time in the past that we can build against. And so the question is, what gets you to the value on top of that technology? And we've been involved with several smart city projects. I imagine a lot of folks on this panel have. And so this is a logical, it's a very simple way to go, okay, smart cities are going to make driving safer, eliminate congestion, et cetera, but there's so many, I'll call it a business problem on top of that, right? Mm-hmm. The technology is the enabler, and that's the easy part relative to this, but it's how do you standardize it? So, part of what Hank went to is, what are the standards in order to pull data out of a vehicle? What is the data you're going to pull out of a vehicle? How do you standardize that data so that if it's coming from different manufacturers, it all gets processed the same way at the situational data warehouse to be able to manage that back out and take appropriate action on it and do it in a timely basis? So I think those are, from a safety standpoint, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit if we can figure out how to communicate sort of standardized open standards that folks can build off of and innovate off of and figure out what the business opportunity is. All the municipalities are saying, hey, we want you to participate. That's great. The challenge for everybody is there's a cost associated with that. What's the return? There's a greater good to society, and that's obviously important. But that's also part of the equation is, okay, what are the value propositions on top of these things?
I see, so you're looking for some virtuous relationship where the public sector and the private sector can gain the utility, but you're talking about usefulness from a societal perspective, if I heard you right. That's great. Any other examples of the usefulness of connected vehicles from other panelists?
I think the obvious one is definitely the fleet management, right? So the moment you put everything onto the internet, it becomes easier for you to look. And it's also very tempting now, because now that you put a vehicle on the internet, how much of the capability do you want to really open up? Do you want to see where the person is driving? Do you want to see the speeds? Do you want to see to what extent?
Can you see it?
Can you see it?
Right.
So that's a completely another whole dimension to this. Another modality to this is the privacy part, which Brian and I were discussing just before this, was with. So let me address that portion where GDPR and the equivalent, which is going to happen in California, for example, is going to create...
why don't you define for everyone what GDPR means?
So GDPR is the European
General Data
Protection. So that has a set of guidelines which tells you what you can do and what you cannot do with the data that you're collecting. And that's a big movement in Europe right now, because the issue now becomes that you have to be, as a vendor or as an OEM or as the collector of the data, you have to have clarity of whose data is where, which means I need to know Ron's data, I need to know Brian's data. I, as an OEM who is collecting that information, even though it belongs to the individuals, should be able to silo these data in different parts of the cloud, so that the moment Brian or Ron comes in and says, hey, John comes and says, I actually want to purge my data, I want to be forgotten, then I should be able, as an OEM or a vendor, to purge that data and let the user be forgotten. Now this creates another level of the added logic on top of the simple data collection which used to happen so far, which is you anonymize the data, you collect it, and you forget about it, and you sell it, or you work with it as a third-party interface. But now there is this added problem of how do you really segregate this data, even when you're collecting the data, not as an afterthought, but during the act of the collection itself. So I think that, coming back to the whole fleet management or the advantage of having connectivity, I think like I said, to us, it almost seems like the use cases are not going to be defined now. The capabilities are to be defined now. You want, and it's very tempting to go down the path of saying, I want to have the ability to see into everything that a car does, all the way from the state of charge to the diagnostics portion of it, obviously the simple things like over-the-air firmware update capabilities. But I think the push is to say, let's open up the vehicle as much as possible, but then again being very, very cognizant of privacy, very cognizant of being the data storage and the compute capacity that we have in the cloud, because how long will you store the data for? Do you store it for 15 years? Do you store it for 10 years? Do you store it for 3 years? Each one comes with its own set of costs. Each one comes with its own set of headaches, especially if you want to be a global brand, because the requirements for data in China is very, very different from the requirements in the US, and very, very different for that in Europe, which means if you have, even if you choose Amazon as your backbone, you're now caught in these different global fights of what gets stored and how it gets stored and how it actually is retrieved.
Thank you. I like the way that you talked about some examples, but then gave some constraints from which we have to work. And you segued into something that I wanted to ask, and I'm going to ask you, Maxime, because as I understand, 5GA is in every continent except Antarctica. So you would be in a position to understand global differences with regard to this type of connectivity and these types of services. Can you elaborate a little bit on some of what you note as global differences?
Well, there are different approaches around the world, and we mentioned, I think one of the panelists mentioned China. China is definitely going forward in terms of deploying 5G, very, very proactive, but also on picking 20 megahertz of bandwidth for the V2V and C-V2X to deploy it. So we do see that China, by making decisions the way they make decisions, triggers the possibility to go very fast in terms of deploying the C-V2X in the next in the next few months, actually. So middle of 2020, we're expecting that there is a full-fledged deployment of C-V2X in China. Now, when it starts in China, then what happens around the world? That's just at the moment we are expecting the regulators to tell us what is going to be possible. So if we're looking at the US, 5GA with its members has requested has done a waiver request in order to be able to operate in the 5.9 gigahertz. So if the technology is mature in China, why can't it be deployed in other parts of the world, and US, for example, and Europe? And we're really looking forward for the regulators to telling us, it's not necessarily to tell us what technology should be used, but rather to stay technology neutral and let the market decide which technology should be deployed in the vehicles, especially in terms of V2V, etc. Now, there are other parts of the world which we are focusing on, the Koreans, the Japanese, as well as also going further to Australia. So, and we are monitoring all these markets, and every single market is expecting decisions on. They actually know that 5G is going to happen. So the 5G network, etc., is going to happen. Now, can we add this little piece of technology for the device-to-device, vehicle-to-vehicle communication? That's at the moment, unfortunately, the regulators that have to tell us how we can use a 5.9 gigahertz band. Now, I would like to come a little bit back on the deployment of 5G. So first, we heard it from you, Don. I mean, it does not start. It's not a switch that you just put and then turn on 5G. It's a step by step, and the way we want to finance 5G is really to to see it as a Swiss Army knife for all types of industry. It's not only falling on the shoulders of the automotive industry. It's so 5G is so versatile that it can offer ultra reliable low latency, for example, for some applications. It can offer broadband for other industries. It can also offer massive IoT for other industries. And that's the power of 5G, because it's going to serve all different industries, and which are through economies of scale then going to finance the huge investment to deploy the 5G networks. And so very important that this Swiss Army knife of 5G is going to serve all the different industries. So we have a different, also from the V2X point of view, so just that device to device point of view, it's not only vehicles that may profit of that interface. We can see that in future the farming industry may also profit of that interface. Drones may profit of that interface, etc. But in 3GPP we have focused first on making sure that the CV2X serve the purpose of the automotive, but that interface may expand to other fields and other verticals.
Thank you. By the way, go ahead.
Something about
Absolutely.
that was really very good, well said. AT&T has over 31 OEMs that are connected through us. Ford is one of our partners. And one of the challenges that was brought to us early on was the ability to allow these cars that were manufactured in other locations find their way around the world and have a connectivity strategy around it. Now, most of that connectivity was on the telemetry side, which allowed for this idea of roaming, and latency wasn't such a big deal in that world. The onset of consumer services like the embedded applications in a TCU and the third-party retail Wi-Fi plans occurred. But because we led in this space, we learned a lot about many things about the global world. And your question is a good one. The differences in network deployments is a real thing, which is one of the reasons why AT&T partnered with Vodafone, and we announced that at Mobile World Congress, to specifically focus on automotive solutions and to help drive a network collaboration that will allow us to help the automotive industry even further, because as we know, both of those companies are pretty strong in this area. Coming together in the ways that we can, responsibly, we think is going to make a big deal here. And we both know a lot about what's happening around the globe for many things. So, but I will say this idea of GDP, the data privacy requires data to stay in country through the whole flow. So it's not just an Amazon server being in the country, it's actually the RAN, the packet core, and the data, and the rest of it staying in the country too. And we spent a lot of time with our partners making sure that happens as well.
But in your original foray, you didn't say that kept you awake at night. So you have, is it secondary? It's a big concern in and of itself, I presume.
What I will say, and this is the thing, I'm very proud to work for AT&T because we've always...
You even have a button that...
I even have, I have the lapel pin.
That's right.
But we have a pedigree of doing the hard.
Right.
We don't shy away from difficult circumstances. Sure. One of the reasons we're doing the FirstNet network in the U.S., which is the public safety network, 25 years, mission critical data. Who would do that? AT&T would do that. And this automotive problem globally is something we want to help solve.
So, and FirstNet is a very worthwhile endeavor, and I encourage people to give encouragement continually to AT&T for that.
Yes, thank you.
I'm turning back to the title, which is of this session, the Cloud and Car-Enabled Digital Service. So we painted a 5G picture in the future, and we have services we want to deliver to our customers, and we have a slightly different set of customers. How do we temper or gauge or set the gauge for expectations, say, in the next 5 years? How can your customers, what is their expectation? That is, roll further ahead 5 years from now, what types of services, or we can still talk about technology, and I'll go through this in a round-robin way. Yeah. I don't know who to pick on first, either Don or you, Brian, but I'll start in the middle, okay?
I'll jump at it. I think in terms of tempering the expectations, I think if you look, you mentioned fleet applications. I think fleet, logistics, commercial applications are already here today. And I think a lot of the first applications that you're going to see developed on connected vehicles are going to be heavily and advancing in terms of fleet and logistics. And you look at it, the entire world has to figure out how to compete with Amazon. And so every single retailer, we're seeing people come to us and say, how can you help me be better connected? And the great thing about those is the spreadsheet is easy to do and show the value proposition. I think the other one that's clear in the near term is being able to do things like warranty and maintenance reduction and all that. They're here now. You can do that right now. The starting to get and infotainment models of being able to get entertainment down to the vehicle. Now, in terms of tempering, I think 5 years out is where you're going to start seeing the more advanced consumer applications show up. Everybody is talking about today being able to order their coffee from their car and pre-order their meal from their car.
I do that with a little window at Jack in the Box. Is there a better way to do that?
I think that's going to be,
All right.
a lot of what you're seeing today are prototypes and demos
Okay,
of things,
all right.
but until we get more standardization, and also look at new forms of user experience in the vehicle, I think those things are going to be a little further off. But the supporting the transportation infrastructure, there's lots of applications that can be here and now.
So pre-5
Don't.
correct?
Oh yeah, don't temper your applications to your enthusiasm for that, because it can, you can already through, Ford connected, light, medium trucks, you can develop applications that are incredibly advanced.
So,
today.
I spoke like an engineer. I used temper as if there was a constraint. So let me just rephrase the question. How can we set, or what can we anticipate as these types of services roll out in the next 5 years?
Yeah,
Maybe that's a better way of saying
I
it.
think in terms of like sort of setting customers' expectations, it's us, particularly as OEMs, that need to respond to customers' expectations, right? The basis of comparison is not, Ford to Chevy or Ford to BMW, but it's the experience in my Ford to the experience that I have in my home. And the fact that increasingly, while our lives do revolve around our smartphones and those devices, I think particularly 5 years from now, consumers are going to be accustomed to just saying what they want, wherever they want, and expecting that to be serviced, right? I think Alexa has had a lot to do with that, but I think if you look at all other devices becoming more and more connected now too, whether it's thermostats or refrigerators or other parts of people's homes, not to mention factories and other infrastructure, it's like this giant computing platform and network, and our ability to be responsive to our customers regardless of where they are. And so in a vehicle environment, right, for us, voice has always been a key part of what's been necessary. First and primarily, it's been around safety and security, right? Leveraging voice because you want your eyes on the road and your hands on the wheel. Increasingly, we see voice, and much more so as we go forward into the future, we see voice as accomplishing a couple of things. Number one, it helps us abstract and minimize the degree of steps that you have to go through to accomplish something. And so we love our touch screens. They're really, really nice, right? But at the end of the day, if I can just say what I want to have happen and it happens, then that's much better than trying to go through a series of menus on a touch screen. We want it to be there. We want it to be great. We want to deliver a great experience, but we'd rather our customers just say what they'd like to have happen. And increasingly, again, as we go forward and as we leverage the data that we get from the vehicle with the informed consent of our customers, as we understand what our customers are doing, they'll get to the point where they don't even have to ask, right? And so we'll know as you get into your vehicle we pretty much know where you're going to go based on the patterns that you've established before. We'll know what the temperature should be in your vehicle based on the patterns that have been established before. We'll know that you're going to stop at your favorite coffee shop and that coffee will be ready for you as you go. And so it's this leveraging the data to deliver a better and better experience over time. And the basis of comparison is what happens in my vehicle versus what happens anywhere else, whether I'm on a cruise or in my home or in my office.
Yeah, I think.
No, I put this in two buckets actually. One of them happens to be what Don was saying about the customer expectation. Sometimes there is a little bit of danger to that as well, where now if you see there's a little bit of frustration from the customers in terms of the autonomy itself, because everybody was saying autonomy is going to be coming, is coming, 2018, 2019, we are almost in 2020, but now they're scaling back. NVIDIA took a big hit, and so everybody's trying to scale back from the promise that they want to make towards what autonomy truly means. So I think that's one bucket where you want to cater to the expectation, but also there is some sense of danger in what truly the customers want and what you end up promising. The second bucket is something which the likes of Apple did, where when Steve Jobs announced in 2007 the iPhone, nobody wanted an iPhone, but everybody went and bought an iPhone. It's almost as if it takes, obviously he was a visionary and he knew what exactly the people wanted, he could sense it. But I think that's one thing that we have to truly take up. One is obviously to cater what we think are the expectations. The other is to go after these visionary use cases. And I think Rivian in some sense is trying to tap that, if you will, where the sense of adventure is in every one of us. It's just that we probably don't have the right outlet, the right avenue to go and figure out how do we truly be adventurous and enjoy it. And I think for us, that is in some sense the 5-year plan of how we truly cater to the adventurers within each one of us, and then use the connectivity, the technology, because the moment you become fully autonomous or even partially autonomous and you're in the outdoors and in the wild, there's some really, really interesting use cases that come up.
Yeah, so I think, I'll be a little bit provocative, right? Consumers don't care about 5G. They don't, right? They don't care about technology. We care about technology because we're technologists. They care about experiences. They care about what it does for me. And they don't care whether it's delivered over 4G, delivered over 5G, just make it real. Make it what I expect. And Don really hit the nail on the head when he's talking about, it's this blend. It doesn't matter whether I'm in my vehicle or I'm in my house or I'm walking down the street. It's this experience that I expect to be pervasive no matter where I am. And it's our job to figure out how to make that happen and make it invisible. And so we're doing a lot of work at SiriusXM relative to voice and relative to delivering services in and around a vehicle. And what is that balance, right? So we're really focused on human-machine interface. Is it, voice is great, but if I have to listen to, hey, there's 7 coffee shops near you, that's probably too many to go through voice. But if I'm driving, I sure as hell shouldn't be looking at a list and touching a touchscreen, right? So there's a balance between those things. And that's all going to evolve as we go. And the thing we all have to keep in mind is frame it around a consumer. What does a consumer want? What is the consumer behavior? And let them tell us effectively how the services have to work. And so that's one. Two is kind of building off what I said earlier. It's, I talked about it as a business problem. The technology isn't hard, it's a business problem. It's really not even a business problem, it's a what's in it for me problem. When you think about data protection, CCPA, which is California Protection Act, the version of GDPR, so if you go back to what I said about smart cities, okay, as a consumer, I have to be informed this data is going to be that I'm going to share this data. I have to be informed how it's going to be used. I have to have the right to delete it. But then what's my self-motivator to share this information with the cities, right? How do I do that? Are they going to pay me to do it? Is it because I'm a good citizen? Is it because it's mandated? And I think that, Hank sort of, Maxime touched on this. When you think about the fact that in the States, we tend to be very laissez-faire. We let the market evolve. It's not a directed way to get things done. You're not going to get an edict from the government, or you're not likely to say, these are the things you're going to go do, that every consumer has to abide by and give up those rights that they inherently have. And so, for us, it's a matter of figuring out what are the things that each entity in the value chain, the businesses, the consumers, the what's in it for me question, and delivering that in a way that solves for their problems and the experiences that they expect.
Thank you, and again, you're a great mind reader. And I'm looking here at the questions from the audience, and I notice that fully half of those which I haven't addressed deal with regulation in one form or another. So I'm going to generalize that and maybe throw a zinger. In terms of the regulatory environment for each of our aspirations, what types of regulations would you like to see, or would you not like to see? And to those in the audience who asked questions along those lines, thank you.
So I think I'll take a stab first. Rather than focus on a specific regulation, I think I'd rather focus on how we would prefer to work with the various government agencies here in the US and around the world, and that is in partnership and cooperation and working with guidelines and standards as opposed to regulations, because from my perspective, by the time you codify a regulation with as fast as the technology is moving, it might not even be relevant anymore. And so a great example is what we've done here in the US. We've talked about vehicle to vehicle. We were part of CAMP, which was an organization focused on DSRC, which was a Wi-Fi based standard of vehicles communicating with each other. It was expected that the government, as part of a proposed rule, was going to mandate literally DSRC, going back to the rulemaking was published back in 2016, the original proposed rule. Got a lot of comments, and so we believed that the technology needed to be neutral in terms of the regulation itself, and we basically said we'd like the opportunity to study C-V2X and its capability. Because of other forces and other factors, right, NHTSA has chosen not to progress forward with that rulemaking. But nonetheless, because of the opportunity to cooperate with them, to partner with them, we've announced that we're going to be deploying C-V2X beginning in 2022 in our Ford vehicles without a regulation being in place. And that was as a result of being able to cooperate with NHTSA, able to show here's what we think the benefits could be if we can do it in this way, much more cost effective, because as Maxime said, we're leveraging the core capability of connectivity that we've already got built into our vehicles. And so from our standpoint, it's more of cooperating and listening and partnership as opposed to saying we want this specific regulation. I think hopefully you'll see the same thing play out in AV as well.
Satu.
No, I think to me the first thing that comes to mind on the regulation side is privacy, because us putting cloud first as our motto for the connected portion of what we do. Obviously, from a regulatory perspective, compliance is very important, but at the same time, it's also important to pick a philosophy of how we want to really do it. If I took the examples of how Netflix versus Apple or Amazon, Netflix was in some sense in the clear, did not take the heat as much as Facebook or everybody else did take, because Netflix was not monetizing the data. Netflix was essentially using the data for figuring out what the best algorithms would be for the users to choose. It would better the algorithms of how the users would look at the interface and say, oh, this actually makes sense of what the next movie should be, or what the next recommendation should be, and so on. Whereas the heat was more on Facebook and the Amazon, simply because of the monetization angle, if you will. So I think philosophically it was very important. I think we have taken a sort of an internal stance on how we want to be using the data, how we want to be cognizant of the privacy aspect of the data that we would end up collecting as a platform, and also being very, very clear and understanding of what the GDPR requirements will be and what it is that California will do, and ultimately what this will look like in 5 years' time. Nobody knows, but then I think it's very important for us to at least internally have the motto on how we view data and privacy, and I think that ultimately should fall in line with the compliance and regulations.
Thanks. Go down the line, Maxime.
I think I did mention the tech neutrality of the regulations. That's essential. So I'm not going to repeat myself, but to go a bit along the line of the previous statements, I think that the right data, the right access to data at the right time is essential in order to create an ecosystem where everyone feels that there is a win-win. And what I mean by that is that there are data that are essential for the operations of the roads that the road operators say, okay, if I have to rely on a mobile network operator, I'm not going to get this data. So and that's their impression, and then therefore, they help to deploy more hardware on their roads. We should avoid that. We should make sure that we create a data ecosystem that is offering access to data to the right persons at the right time. So road operator would then have the certainty that through the data collection that is conducted by the different vehicle manufacturers, that information can be, or the right compiled or aggregated information is then provided to the operator. And if we can give or create this element of trust between the different parties, then we would have a much more buy-in in the ecosystem of the data collection, the connectivity of the vehicles, the clouds that are run by the vehicle manufacturers, the cloud that are run by third parties, etc. We have to create this ecosystem with the right APIs, the right interfaces, and the right data delivered to the right people.
Hank, what about you? Any regulations that you abhor, any that you would embrace in order to further the cause here?
So, in general, I'm also, most industries that I've ever been in, the government heavily regulating them doesn't do much at all, other than incent people to simply figure out ways to go around the regulations, which is already happening with GDPR, and there's always a way around it. So I definitely stand for cooperation and industry-driven to drive the right thing. The other area that in a regulatory route is, since we do a lot of active safety systems and enable advanced data collection and whatnot for active safety systems, one of the things that concerns me is some of the liability aspects around these systems. And believe it or not, there's already people today who are actually afraid to collect data. Because if you collect the data, you can therefore be liable for it.
Oh, so I didn't ask for tort reform, but yes, I see your point. Yes.
But I'll tell you, it has to happen, because if you don't collect the data and learn, you're disincenting learning by doing that. So, the spirit of the regulatory environment needs to incent the right thing to do, right, as opposed to be sort of end results, absolute legal liability that, I really think we're going to have to look at that in order to really drive the industry forward with this active learning aspect that needs to happen for.
Good point.
Yep.
Mitch?
Sure. So, and I'm being sensitive to time. I think that, to echo Don, standards rather than regulatory, I think is the first sort of precept. To go back to something that Hank said in his opening, so I think this has all got to be built on open standards. And we had an opportunity, we had the pleasure of doing a keynote at CES this year, and we sort of put out a challenge to the organizations at large around open standards and how do we work together. I think that's what we've got to do going forward. The good news is, specific to vehicle data, there are a couple of standards bodies now, both in Europe and here, that are starting to actively take that up, that we're starting to gain some momentum, at least the discussion around building on that.
Thank you. Brian?
Probably one of the more regulated people on the panel. And with the current administration, where one regulation comes in, two have to go, and who knows how long that's going to last. We don't need more regulation, that's for sure. We do need more standards. It would be a good thing. And if we're going to ever have regulation, let's at least make it equal, and not have one party subjected to over-regulation and another party not, which doesn't help grow the ecosystem. There really are no regulations that I can see, and I don't want the government to mandate anything for anybody. The government should do what it does. It helps us influence standards, helps us provide good testing capabilities by bringing large groups of people together to figure that out. That's really a good role for them.
Thank you. Good points all. We have about 2 more minutes, and I have reserved maybe the last 30 seconds to Maxime to make an announcement. So any last words? We don't feel compelled, but any short last words? What was not covered that you're just dying to talk about in regards to this topic?
Well, I think, so for me, this is a really exciting time, right? As a product guy, life is about experimenting. And this is a great time to be able to experiment, because suddenly everybody has decided connected cars are the thing. And we have to figure out what we're going to do with them and how we're going to make society safer and how we're going to create cool user experiences and how we're going to deliver an experience in the backseat of the car so the kids are busy and they're not fighting while I'm driving down the road. It's a great time to be able to sort of play in the sandbox that technology is starting to enable.
And
I feel the same way. I'm sorry.
okay.
I feel the same way. I feel like a renaissance has occurred in my career because I get to go around the world talking to guys like this to try to influence this wonderful next place we're going to go to.
And I'll add on, play in this sandbox now. Don't think this has to wait for 5 years from now.
Those are wise words as well.
We have,
Yeah.
we have, large percentage of vehicles are already connected.
Right.
Start playing with those
We
use
know.
cases now, right? Do
Okay.
it. Like,
So I see lots of nods of assent. So I'm going to assume that you've said it all and we've all agreed. And Maxime, you have 43 seconds, 42, 41.
Well,
I don't-
it's a very short one. I mean, I just so as you may know, or as you have seen, this is sponsored by 5G Automotive Association. This panel, even though we are not all member of 5G Automotive Association, we wanted to be expansive in terms of representation. So, but we have a lounge area, a networking area. On that corner of the exhibition, and we are organizing at 4:30 p.m. in about 2 hours, or is that so? We are organizing a little reception there, and you're all welcome to
Well,
have
thank
a
you.
drink with us, and then to also chat and exchange ideas. So there is there it is. It's coming.
So
on the panel.
I thank you for that. I want to thank the panelists, and please give a round of applause to the panelists for coming and exposing their thoughts. And I'd like to thank the audience for your rapt attention and the very good questions that I've received. Sorry I couldn't address them all.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much. This was fun for all of us, and hopefully you too.